Hello, welcome to QE Auto. Today we're going to talk about front disc brakes. First thing we need to do is talk about the parts that go along with front disc brakes. First we have our caliper that houses the brake pads that are underneath that apply the pressure via hydraulic fluid through the brake line. The caliper is attached to the caliper mounting bracket and then finally to the rotor or the disc. Now we're going to slowly start taking the front disc assembly apart. We'll start by using a socket and ratchet setup. This is a 15 mil. Make sure you are going to the left, so 12 o'clock going left, not ratcheting or going to the right. We don't want to be tightening. We want to be going left. We are working in a mirrored image, so behind us. So sometimes it can get a little bit confusing. So make sure you have the ratchet in the correct way before you go and take off the bolts. So there are two bolts on the back of the caliper and they need to be just broken free and slowly taken out. Sometimes you can do it by hand, sometimes you will need the tool. Looks like I need the tool for this one. So sometimes it's not just a bolt that is inside of the caliper. Sometimes it's a different type of Allen hex bolt where you would need a different type of tool right here. Allen heads. They're driver bits. So just make sure that you have the right tools before you start the job. In our case, that is what our bolt looks like. This is also called a slider pin. We'll place it down on the hoist or on the ground if you're working on the ground until we are ready to do our cleanup. Our second slider pin. Now they are the same size, so these ones are interchangeable, but always make sure that you are looking at the bolts to where they come out of, because they may need to go back in the proper location. To remove the caliper, you may need to use a pry bar carefully between two metal surfaces so that you don't damage any parts or equipment. There are also little slider bars or guide bars for the brake pad, so you need to watch out that you don't damage anything as you're taking anything off. Once you get the caliper started to come out, try and do the remainder by hand, give it a wiggle, and the caliper should come off the brake pads. Okay. The caliper is now off. We'll talk about the caliper a little bit later, but for now, we can't let the caliper hang off of the flex line that supplies the hydraulic fluid, so what we need to do is we need to use a bungee cord or a tie wire, and we need to hang that caliper up from somewhere on the vehicle. Now in this case we have a coil spring where it can be attached to, and this will just safely hold the caliper up and out of the way so that you can continue to do the work safely. Now with the caliper out of the way and hanging safely by the bungee cord and not by the brake line, let's talk about the brake pads. As you take the brake pads out, you will notice some grooves on the inside and possibly some lubricant on the outside. We'll talk about that in a second, but I want you to make sure that as you're taking them out, you're placing them in the orientation on a workbench or on the floor where they come out. So the front, or the one closest to you, will be placed upwards, not on the brake pad closest to you. The rear brake pad shall be taken out and placed on the inside or opposite of the front brake pad. Okay. Furthermore, these little slider clips can come off at this point. We'll pop them off if your vehicle does have them. Again, placing them in conformity of where they are located on the caliper bracket. Next, we will need to see if these brake pads will need to be replaced. Now, depending on the wear indicators on the brake pads, that's these grooves right here, and the condition of what you can see on the brake pads, we also have to worry about the pad thickness. Now it's attached to a big metal plate on the back side, that's where the pressure is applied, but the brake pad itself for front brakes needs to be at least 1/8 inch thick in order to be safe on the road for front brakes. Now in this case we have a brake pad or brake liner measuring tool, and as you can see, red's bad, yellow's like a warning, and green is good. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to carefully check the level of this brake liner, and right here I see that we have 6 mil or 0.236. So, and 1/8 of an inch is 0.125, so at this point 0.236 means that we're still good on our brake pad. Another warning, if you don't have one of these tools, you can easily see that once these grooves have been fully worn down to that marker, that is a good sign that you have depleted your brake pads. That means they need to be replaced. If you look on the inside brake pad, so the side that came from the inside of the vehicle, that is where you might see a brake warner, or what we like to call a squealer. Okay? It's a little metal tab that will start to press on that rotor, metal to metal, as soon as that brake pad wears down far enough. This will squeal really loud and indicate to the driver that there needs to be servicing done. Okay, so for now we'll just lay them back on those pads and we'll work on the caliper mounting bracket. So now with the brake pads out, now we turn our attention to the caliper mounting bracket. There are two very large bolts that attach this bracket onto the steering system, on the knuckle. The different vehicles have different ways of attaching it. So there's two very large bolts that need to be loosened off. These are torqued on there very tight, so you may need a breaker bar to assist you in removing those bolts. Again, making sure that you are in the lefty-loosey direction. But for our case, I have pre-loosened them so that we can get going on this demo. So I'm going to be using a smaller ratchet and the correct socket, reaching behind and getting those two bolts loose. Making sure not to have the caliper get in the way, or making sure that the caliper does not fall down during this. Again, placing the bolts where you can see them, noticing which one's to the top and which one is to the bottom. As you get close to removing the second bolt, you want to make sure that you're holding that bracket, because after that second bolt is removed, nothing else will be holding it. So it can fall directly onto the floor, potentially onto your feet or hands. We do not want that. Slide out the caliper bracket and place that for service coming up next. With the caliper bracket out of the way, now we turn our attention to the rotor itself. Now this one, as you can see, is a floating rotor, means that it will come off as soon as you take the lug nuts off. But we need to first determine the thickness of the rotor so that we can determine if it's safe to use to a minimum thickness that you can find on ALLDATA or other sites or repair manuals to see what the minimum thickness is required. To do this, we need to use a micrometer. Okay. And you can see another video on how to use that, how to use a micrometer, but you will be measuring the thickness of the rotor there to determine if it is good and safe to use. If it is safe to use and potentially has little lips or grooves that are on there, then we need to turn our attention to the brake machine, and that would be rotating and turning the rotor. With everything disassembled and removed from our brake system, we can now turn our attention to brake cleanup. So we'll start with the reverse order of how we took everything off. So the rotor, like I mentioned, is a floating rotor. So this will go onto the studs and come off. So we will need to take the wire brush and clean up the back plate, the hub, so that the rotor can go on nice and easy. Then we had our caliper mounting bracket. Now this one is quite dirty, and if you're doing this for yourself, you need to make sure that you're cleaning in all the areas that had parts attached to it, especially. So where the little brake pad guides were, those need to be cleaned up underneath. We need to clean up where the slide pins go. We need to clean up where the bolts were inserted. Okay? And if you need to use a wire brush, you can do so. If you really need to clean up anything really good, you can use brake cleaner. Now, brake cleaner is important for cleaning up the brake system because of the brake dust that is generated by the brake pads. They will wear out, and in that brake pad material, there is a chance of asbestos dust. Now, if you lubricate everything with brake cleaner and you start cleaning with brake cleaner, that will stop that brake dust from getting airborne and potentially being breathed in. So, if you're using brake cleaner, you can load up the area that you're cleaning. Make sure that you do have a bin to catch all the extra fluid so it's not just dropping on the floor. Have a rag ready to go. And the biggest thing of importance is brake cleaner is flammable. So you need to make sure that you are using a nylon brush and not a metal steel brush so that you do not have any sparks forming. So when you're using brake cleaner, you must use a nylon brush with brake cleaner. Okay. Furthermore, let's talk about the brake pads. So the brake pads need to be cleaned up as well. You want to try and limit the amount of brake cleaner that's applied to the brake pad itself, but you definitely do want to clean up the back plates of all extra lubricant, the slide bars, and give it a good brushing all over the place so that all the dust is removed and all the old lubricant is removed. The slide bars, like I talked about, that's where the brake pads ride in. You want to make sure those are nice and polished. They need to be shiny if they're located on this vehicle. Okay. And then finally, let's talk about the bolts that hold everything together. So there is some lubricant on here. They are nice and gross and disgusting. They got old grease on there. We're going to put some new stuff on, so make sure those get cleaned up as well. And finally, the caliper itself. So the caliper itself, you need to clean a couple key positions. One is the piston, this big ring here, and then the pads that the brake pad comes in contact with. Those are the two most important areas that need to get cleaned on the caliper. It's always a good idea to clean up the rest of the caliper as well, but those are the two main areas. At this time, I would also like to stress the importance of not loosening, and I repeat, not loosening this bolt that is attached to the brake line or the little fitting that's underneath called the bleed screw. These hold the hydraulic fluid, and as soon as you loosen any of these bolts, we have to do what's called a brake bleed. So please leave those two attached unless absolutely necessary. They need to stay attached to the caliper, so we do not need to do a brake bleed. So now I will be quickly doing a cleanup, and we'll bring you back as soon as everything's cleaned up for reassembly.